So the notes for today, again, this is the first material that's going to be on exam number 3 now. Okay, so the stuff that ends the material for exam 2 ended on Monday. Okay, and then this is the first set of notes in the material for exam 3. Okay, so diving into the heart a little bit more, diving into trying to understand cardiac output, which is the overall amount of blood that's coming out of the heart per minute. Okay. So let's just do this as a quick review, because this is important for exam 2 coming up on Friday. Okay, so what I'd love to do for a second, I want to send you guys your breakout rooms on Zoom, and then for the people here in class, turn to the person you've been talking to and talk about these 3 types of action potentials. Okay, talk about what ion flow leads to each one of the numbers there on each one, and then definitely identify which action potential is involved in which tissue, okay, or which cell. Okay, so do that as a brief review. I'll just give you a couple minutes to do that. So go ahead, if you're here in class, go ahead and start talking through that. If you're on Zoom, I'll make sure you're in a breakout room with somebody.
Maybe I'll start at the top.
Yep. I don't think you've got it yet, Catherine, right? You get it, Zita? You already got it? All right, guys, let's come back together. Anybody not get the sign-in sheet yet? I think Florence, right? Yeah. You go, no, you're good. All right. So let's talk about what leads to each of these things, okay? So let's do the easy ones first. So repolarization is always caused by what? What ion flow in what direction? Potassium, so repolarization, always potassium going out, okay? For all of them, right? So for that one, and for that one, always potassium going out, okay? Now, first of all, this one will be a muscle cell or a neuron, right? This one's a cardiac myocyte. Okay, and then these ones are the pacemaker cells, right? Are those autorhythmic cells, right? In the SA node and the AV node. Okay, so number 1 down here And here, what ion flow causes those two? Which one? Which ion? Yell it out, somebody. Sodium, okay. Sodium, yes. So we got sodium there, same as here, right? So those three, those are sodium going in, okay? So we got sodium going in there, sodium going in there, and then, there we go, sodium going in there, okay? And then we got a couple, then we have two that are named 2 here. So this one and this one, okay? So which ion flow is responsible for that one? And some, you guys can throw it in there on the chat too, just put in the ion and which direction. There we go. So calcium, and which direction, in or out? Into the cell or out of the cell? You guys are here in the classroom. In, yeah, perfect. So that one's going to be calcium in. So that would be there with number 2, there with number 2. Okay. And then the only one we haven't really touched on yet is number 4 here, hyperpolarization. Which ion flow is important for that one? Potassium again, right? Same here, same as that one. Potassium going out again. That looks like a mess there, that slide. Hopefully you were following along as I was doing it, because right now it just looks like a total mess. Okay, anybody need clarification on those? Because that did get pretty messy. Questions? We good? On the chat, on Zoom, you guys got questions? Okay, all right, so that's just a little bit of a review. Let's start out with this video here. I'm gonna go over to my app here and show it this way. It's just a short video that kind of walks us through what cardiac output is. There we go.
With each contraction of the ventricles, blood is pumped out of the heart. Stroke volume is the amount of blood a ventricle pumps out in one contraction.
Can you guys hear that on Zoom? Oh, good, okay.
Action. Cardiac output is the volume of blood that each ventricle ejects every minute. To find the cardiac output volume, multiply the number of heartbeats in 1 minute by the stroke volume. At rest, the cardiac output for an average adult male is about 5.25 liters, 4.9 liters for an adult woman. Cardiac output increases with physical activity, rising to a maximum that may be 4 to 7 times greater than the resting output. This difference between resting and maximum output is known as cardiac reserve. Heart rate and stroke volume are regulated by the autonomic nervous system and by hormones in the bloodstream. Other factors such as age, weight, and physical fitness also influence cardiac output.
Okay. All right, so that's just kind of a little overview. Let's talk about the overall role of the cardiovascular system, then we'll get into calculating some of those variables here in just a sec. Okay, so when we think of the cardiovascular system, we want to think about transportation of things around the body, right? So we're transporting nutrients around the body, right? Glucose, lipids, proteins, amino acids. Okay, we're also transporting gases, obviously, right? That's probably the one we mainly think of as transporting oxygen. Also transporting waste products, right? CO2, nitrogenous waste. Anytime we break down protein in the body, we end up with nitrogenous waste. And then transporting hormones, right? We just finished up with the endocrine system, so we got to have some way to get those hormones around the body, right? They can be released, but if they don't have any way to get around, then they're kind of worthless, okay? So we got the cardiovascular system to do that. Also important for regulating our blood pressure, body temperature, and our pH. And then the cardiovascular system plays a key role in protection of the body as well with our immune system, right? This is how our immune cells get around the body to be able to interact with things that aren't supposed to be there and help destroy them. And then the whole clotting system in the body is a part that we'll jump into here in the next couple of weeks as well, and prevention of blood loss. Okay, the body temperature one isn't one that we think about much, but one of the main ways that your body deals with heat is by moving your blood to your skin, right? So when you get hot, you know that your skin turns more red, it gets hot. You can feel heat radiating off of your friend when you're next to them, when they've just been exercising, right? That's because you get all this vasodilation in your skin, and then that takes that warms up your skin, which then your skin can kind of radiate off some heat, and that's one way that we get rid of heat. Okay, so let's look at cardiac output itself here. Okay, so cardiac output is typically going to be abbreviated that way, either as CO or sometimes as Q as well. So sometimes you'll see it as Q with a dot over it. Okay, it's always going to be in liters per minute. Okay, and to get that, we do heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, heart rate is always in beats per minute. Stroke volume is always in liters per beat, or typically it's actually going to be in milliliters per beat. Okay, so when we times those two together, there's a beats on the top and a beats on the bottom, right? So those are going to cancel out, and now we have a volume on the top and minutes on the bottom. So that's how we end up with this liters per minute there, right? Okay, so let's do a couple calculations here. Okay, so you guys in class, go ahead and calculate this on your phones or whatever you want. Calculate those two, resting and maximal. And I'm going to open up the clicker thing here to send in a number. Okay, so once you send in the maximal cardiac output there, now you're going to have to put it into liters per minute. Okay, stroke volume in both of these is in mils per minute. Okay, so you're going to have to move that decimal place over 3 places. If you're in class here, feel free to double check with somebody next to you. And just so you guys know, on Honor Lock, there's always a calculator there. I think I made you use the calculator on that practice quiz that you did, but just as a reminder, if you come across questions like this on the exam, then that calculator is always there for you to use. All right, so you're putting in the maximal cardiac output number there and hitting submit or send. Yeah, if you're here in class, feel free to double check with the person next to you, see if you got the same answer. All right, anybody else there on the app? Got 59, should be some more of you than that. Okay, let's look at that resting one first. I won't shut it off yet. You still got a chance to send that in. Okay, so the resting values, we take 70 mils times 75 beats per minute, right? That's going to give us a 5.25. Okay, so if you didn't convert that, then you would have had what, 5,000, 2,500, right? Is that what it was? Yeah. So then got to convert that into liters per minute just by moving the decimal place over to the left 3 places. Okay, so you can do that after you do the calculation if you want. It's probably a little bit easier than working with the decimal. So yeah, 5.25. Okay, so then the maximum value, how many people we got there? Anybody else need to send that in? Okay, see what you guys said. Okay, so a couple of you sent in the first one, but most of you looks like you got about 28. And that's right, so 28 liters per minute. Okay. All right, any questions on that? Pretty basic calculations for sure. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about each of those factors underneath cardiac output. Right, so cardiac output, again, heart rate times stroke volume. So we'll talk about each of those factors and a little bit about how they're controlled. Okay, so heart rate control is going to be, the heart rate is controlled as far as the brain activity is by the medulla, right, medulla oblongata. Okay, parasympathetic control of the heart is driven by the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. Okay, so that vagus nerve goes all the way down to the heart and interacts with it. Okay, and its neurotransmitter that it's going to release is called acetylcholine. same as the one in skeletal muscle, right? And then on the sympathetic side, we've got the cardiac accelerator nerve. It really splits into multiple nerves. Okay, and then the neurotransmitter there is norepinephrine. Okay, so both of these don't only affect heart rate, but they also affect how forceful the heart contracts, which is called contractility. Okay. All right, so the kind of the pathways for each of these and how they work. In order to increase heart rate, the medulla is going to activate those cardiac accelerator nerves. They're going to release norepinephrine into the junction between the neurons and the cardiac muscles, pacemaker, the muscle and the pacemaker cells, and that increases heart rate. Okay. In order to decrease heart rate, we got the medulla interacting with the vagus nerve, acetylcholine release there, and that's going to go to the cardiac muscle and pacemaker cells and decrease heart rate. Okay, so the natural rhythm of the sinoatrial node we talked about last time is about 100 beats per minute, right? So 100 beats per minute, that's much higher than most of our resting heart rate. So what that means is just at rest right now, most of us have some vagal nerve activity on the heart, slowing down our heart to be at the resting level that it's at. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much all the detail we'll go into as far as heart rate goes on this one. We'll spend most of the rest of the time talking about stroke volume. Okay, so the equation for stroke volume is driven by these two values right here. Okay, so stroke volume is EDV, also known as end diastolic volume, minus ESV, end systolic volume. Okay, and what that really means is how much blood started in the left ventricle right before contraction. And then the second variable is how much blood is left over in the left ventricle right after contraction. That's ESV. Okay, so how much blood is in the left ventricle before contraction? That's our end diastolic volume. Okay, because the diastole means relaxing of the heart. Okay, so at the end of rest, how much blood's there, right? That's as full as it's going to get. How much blood do we start with in the heart before contraction? Okay. And then the second one, how much blood is in the ventricles after contraction, right? That one is end systolic volume. So at the end of contraction, what's left over in the heart, right? That's end systolic volume. So then the difference between those two is how much came out, right? It's how much we started with versus how much is left over. The difference between those two is how much came out of the heart, and that's stroke volume. Okay, so a couple more calculations here. Okay, actually there's 3 calculations in a row on these sides, well 4, so 2 here, and then you got this one, and you got this one, okay? So I'm gonna send you guys on Zoom to your breakout rooms to do all of these calculations, okay? And you guys in the classroom can do it as well, okay? So we got 2 stroke volume calculations here. The next slide is going to be calculating cardiac output when I give you heart rate and end diastolic volume and systolic volume, and then last one, calculate end systolic volume when I give you stroke volume and end diastolic volume. Okay, so on the clicker app here, let's just have you send in the last question, which would be this one. Okay, so do all 4 of these calculations, and you're going to send in this one on the app. Okay, and I'm going to send you guys back to your breakout rooms for a couple of minutes to work through this. All right, here we go.
Dr. Sawyer, is it calculated in liters or?
Stroke volume, you're going to want it in milliliters. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Good question, Justin. And again, you guys in class, feel free to work with the person next to you. Make sure you're on the same page with each of these. No, you're good. similar to the morning class. So. Yeah. The last one, yeah. Send in that last one on the app. All right, guys, so send that in if you haven't yet. So you're just sending in the answer to the last one. Okay, I think everybody's back. Anybody else need to send that in? Give you another second to do so. So let's start with looking at these ones. Okay, so calculating stroke volume is the simple, just EDV minus ESV, giving you those numbers there. So the first one, typical resting might be around 70 mils per beat, maximal values somewhere around 135. Okay, we got that. Next one here, if you want to calculate cardiac output in this way, then we can first of all need to calculate stroke volume. So what was our stroke volume here? Yell this out for me. 140, yeah, so 140 mils times that by our 100, okay. So what do we end up with? What is that, 14? Yeah, 14, okay, liters per minute, okay. And then this last one, so we get calculate ESV from this, okay. So let's see what you guys said. Okay, so most people are saying 30, okay. So we got stroke volume is normally EDV minus ESV, okay? So we've got 150 there, we've got 180 there, and so we just need to solve for ESV, right? So we're gonna, yeah, so we end up with 30, right? So the difference between those two, 30 mils. Okay. All right, any questions about those calculations? Somewhat simple calculations. The part that most, if people get these wrong on exams, tends to be a conversion issue going from mils to liters. So just make sure you got that part figured out and should be fine. Okay, any questions on Zoom there, guys? Okay. All right, so that's stroke volume. Let's talk about the 3 factors that dictate stroke volume. Okay, so yeah, Emmy's got a question there. So it's cardiac output in liters and the rest in mils. Yep, exactly, Emmy. So we're going to always express stroke volume, EDV and ESV always in mils. and cardiac output is almost always expressed in liters per minute. Good clarification. Thank you. Good. Okay. All right. So there's three factors that determine stroke volume. Okay. The first one is the amount of blood that makes its way back to the heart before contraction. And that one's called preload. Okay. So how much blood is coming back to the heart? Okay. So that makes sense. So that's going to be partially determining how much blood comes out is how much blood we started with, right? Secondly, it's this concept called afterload. Okay. And afterload is not the blood left over in the heart after contraction. Okay, a lot of people think that because they jump right from preload being the heart and the blood before contraction. Afterload is not the blood in the heart after contraction. Afterload is the pressure that the heart has to overcome to open up that aortic valve. Okay, so remember the left ventricle is going to pump, connects to the aorta, but it's got to open up that aortic valve to do so. So it has to overcome the pressure on the other side of that valve to do that. And that's what afterload is. Okay. We'll talk more about that one in a sec. Okay. And then lastly, it's just how hard the heart is contracting, which is called contractility. So preload, afterload, contractility, those three important concepts that control stroke volume. Okay. So we'll talk about each of those here a little bit more. Okay. So preload is, since it's that blood coming back to the heart, it's going to be measured by end diastolic volume, right? That makes sense. That was how much blood is in the heart before contraction. So if we want to know how much blood came back to the heart, this is a pretty good measure of it. Okay. The more blood we have in the left ventricle, then that's going to increase stroke volume. The less blood we have in the left ventricle is going to decrease stroke volume. Okay. So then what determines this? What determines how much blood actually comes back to the heart? And that's all about venous return. Okay, so all that blood is coming back from your veins, dumping into those vena cava, which is going to dump into your right atrium, right? So the amount of blood actually coming back there is really what varies, and that's what's going to dictate your preload, which dictates your end diastolic volume. Okay. So this has kind of a direct impact on how hard your heart is contracting too. Okay, so remember last semester when we talked about the length tension relationship in skeletal muscle, right? We did it with the bicep curl, where if you were all the way stretched out and trying to do a curl versus all the way up here versus right here in the middle, this one in the middle was the one that produced the most force, right? Because we had the most interaction of actin and myosin that way, and we also still had some room to shorten, okay? It's very similar in the heart, actually, because those heart muscle cells are muscle cells too, and we're relying on actin and myosin, so we need actin and myosin interaction. So by stretching out the heart a little bit, when we fill it up with blood, that gives us a better length tension relationship, and that gives us a little bit more interaction between actin and myosin, and so that allows us to contract a little bit more forcefully. Okay, so if we increase preload, then that increases actin myosin interaction, okay, and that's going to increase force of contraction. Okay, so that's kind of the number one way. The number two way is just the fact that the heart's elastic, right? And so when we stretch it out, we fill it up with blood and stretch it out, the connective tissue and the muscle itself is elastic, so it bounces back, right? So we stretch it out hard with a lot of blood, and then it's just going to bounce back, right? So let's just really fill it up and then bounce back. All right, so that also increases force of contraction. Okay, the more we fill it up, the harder it bounces back. So preload doesn't only give us, by increasing preload, that doesn't only give us more blood getting pumped out because there's more blood to begin with, but it also gives us more blood being pumped out because it helps the heart contract harder. Okay, questions on that? Oops, sorry. Hold on to that. Okay, so second concept, afterload. So afterload, again, was that pressure that the heart has to overcome to get blood out of the left ventricle or to open up that aortic valve. So we measure that by looking at blood pressure. Okay, that makes sense, right? The pressure in that aorta is highly related to just our overall blood pressure in our body. And this MAP is mean arterial pressure. Okay, and it's really like an average blood pressure. It's not the same as our systolic, it's not the same as our diastolic. It's an average of those two over time. That gives us a good idea of how much pressure is on the other side of that aortic valve at all times. Okay, so when we're in a situation where somebody has high blood pressure or high afterload, it's important to think about what that would do to how we open up those semilunar valves. Okay, remember the semilunar valves are the aortic and the pulmonary. Okay, so if we've got a lot of pressure on the other side of that aortic valve, that means it's going to take more pressure that the ventricle has to create before it opens, right? So it means the semilunar valves open a little bit later with higher afterload. Okay, and then as the ventricles are starting to relax, pressure that the ventricles are creating is dropping, right? But if that aortic pressure is higher, that means they're going to close sooner. All right, so the overall effect on the time that the semilunar valves are open, in this case with higher afterload, is going to be less, right? So you put all that together, and that decreases stroke volume, right? It's got to decrease stroke volume because we got the valves opening later, closing sooner, being open for a less amount of time. So that means we just have less time to eject blood from the heart. Okay, with low afterload, it's the opposite, right? So they open earlier, close later, and they can be open more time. So that's going to lead to an increase in stroke volume. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why one of your vital signs is your blood pressure, right? And one of the very important measures of your health is your blood pressure, right? So normal blood pressure is around 120/80, right? We could calculate the mean arterial pressure of that, but it doesn't really matter for this, but it's about 120/80, right? And so what that means is the heart has to overcome it has to overcome the average of that, which is probably somewhere around from around 100, right? So right around 100 millimeters of mercury, the heart has to overcome that amount of pressure every time it opens up the aortic valve. But let's say your blood pressure is 140/90 instead, right? Now we're talking about a mean arterial pressure of maybe 115 or 120. So every single time your heart beats, it doesn't get as much blood out, or if it does, then it has to work harder to get that blood out, okay? And that's eventually what leads to heart failure. That's the number one cause of heart failure is high blood pressure, okay? Because the heart's just working a little bit extra for your whole life, right? And that can lead to heart failure. Okay, any questions on that so far? So we got preload, we got afterload, and the last one is contractility. Okay, these are the three factors that dictate stroke volume again. Okay, so contractility measured by ejection fraction. Okay, so this number is calculated by EDV over ESV, or that's stroke volume, right? It's calculated by stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. So this is like a percentage of the blood that we started with that got out, right? Because the stroke volume is what came out. End diastolic volume is what you started with in the heart before contraction. Divide those two by each other and then times by 100. That's just to turn it into a percentage, right? And that gives you the percentage of the blood that you started with, what percent came out, okay? And so go ahead and do this calculation here. So you can get ejection fraction with both of these. You got ESV and ED for both of these. Okay, go ahead and calculate both of those and send in that maximal one for me again. So you obviously got to calculate stroke volume first. You can leave it in mils. There's no reason to put it in liters. Okay, so send in the second one there, the maximal one, when you're ready. And this one here, this ejection fraction, is a very important clinical marker of heart function. Okay, typically we're going to see it around 60% at rest. Once you start dropping below 50 towards 40, that's what it looks like when you're in heart failure. People that are, this is one of the key measures they look at to see kind of where to place you on the heart transplant list, right? Once you get down close to 30 or 20% ejection fraction, you're moving up on the list because that's your heart is in bad shape. All right, send that in whenever you're ready there. Give you about another 20 seconds. All right, so let's look at this one. So first of all, we got to calculate stroke volume, right? So 120 minus the 50, our stroke volume here is 70, right? And we're going to divide that by our 120. And what was that? So we get about 58% there at rest. Okay, and then maximally, we got to do the same thing, calculate stroke volume first, divide it by end diastolic volume, and we get about 84%. Okay, let's see what you guys said there. Good, so most of you are right there, right at about 84%. Okay, good. Okay, questions on that one, on how to do that calculation? Just got to get your stroke volume first and divide by the end diastolic volume. Okay, and this is primarily controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the more sympathetic nervous system activity we have on the heart, that leads to more of that norepinephrine being released by those cardiac accelerator nerves, and also epinephrine and norepinephrine are being released by the adrenal medulla going through the blood, right? Those all have the same effects of increasing contractility in the heart. Okay, so here's what I want to do for a sec. Here's all the numbers, just putting all those together, and I added the blood pressure ones. But what I'd like for you to do is use these numbers here, okay, and then go to the next slide. So it says use the numbers on the previous slide to decide, number one, which factors help increase cardiac output, okay? Which way do they change, right? So then just go down the list here and just say increase or decrease for each of these, right? Which way does heart rate go, increase or decrease, stroke volume, EDV, ESV, all the way down the list. And then just kind of talk about either in your breakout group or the person next to you, which of these factors would be the key ones that are helping our cardiac output increase from rest up to maximal exercise. Okay, so again, you're using these numbers to kind of see how the numbers change from rest to max. And then you're going through this and just saying, do these go up or down? And do you think that contributes to our increase in cardiac output that we see in a graph like this, where we go from low intensity exercise all the way up to maximal exercise? We see that continual rise in cardiac output. That's the only thing that's letting us do that. Okay, so send you to breakout rooms again and give you a couple minutes to discuss this, and I'll bring you back. Go ahead, guys and people in class, go ahead and chat with each other about this. Oh, I guess we're just supposed to. So we're just supposed to say the stroke volume, if that. But then how does it go up, right? How does it go up? Yeah. So that, do all of them. Yeah, all of them. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
No, I think you'd want, well, you'd want inside.
All right, guys, let's come back together here. Everybody's coming back from the breakout rooms there. Okay, so let's just walk through each of these together. So obviously, we all know that our heart rate goes up when we're exercising, right? So that's definitely one that goes up. That's a huge factor in helping us get more cardiac output, right? Okay, we know the stroke volume goes up as well. Oops. We know the stroke volume goes up. The more important or newer part of today would at least would be how does it go up, right? And I saw some of you had this situation where end diastolic volume went up, but then systolic volume went down, right? And that's the important thing to understand here is that we're getting more blood going back to the heart, right, with more venous return, okay? But then even with more blood getting back to the heart, we still end up with less after contraction. So that means the heart must be pumping harder, right? And so we'll get to that one in a second. We'll get down to that because that's directly connected to contractility, right? But in order to increase stroke volume, we want to see end diastolic volume going up and then systolic volume going down, okay? Preload, that's the end diastolic volume one, so that one definitely goes up, okay? What about afterload? Which way did mean arterial pressure go, up or down? Give me a thumbs up or down on Zoom or in the class. Okay, afterload, did it go, in the numbers that I gave you, did it go up or down? Got blood pressure there, right? It went from 94 to 103, right? So it went up. That's what happens when we exercise, right? Our blood pressure goes up for sure. All right, so afterload goes up. Oops. Gosh, sorry guys. Afterload goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up. Okay, so all of these things so far have been helping to increase stroke volume. But what about that one? It's the opposite, right? It's exactly the opposite. That actually fights against us a little bit, right? That actually moves towards decreasing our stroke volume a little bit. Okay, but it's just a necessary thing that has to happen. We need to increase our blood pressure to move blood around the body faster. But that does make it a little bit harder to open up that aortic valve, right? So that's just part of how the heart has to function here. Okay, but then the contractility, the ejection fraction, well, contractility went up because we saw ejection fraction go up, and some more, and that's kind of the direct measure of it. But some kind of evidence of that too was that decrease in end systolic volume, right? Because if we started with the same amount of blood, but ended up with less, that must, only way to explain that is that the heart beat harder, right, and push more blood out. Okay, so some important things to think about there just in looking at how the heart goes through those changes to get us more cardiac output. Okay, questions on any of those? So this one's definitely increasing stroke volume as well. All right. Okay, so a couple more things to kind of finish this off here. So those three factors that dictate stroke volume again. Okay, so number one is the blank. The left heart is determined by the blood, or by the volume of blood coming from the pulmonary circuit. Right, so that's our preload. Okay. Number two is determined by the heart's intrinsic pumping ability. Right, that's our contractility. And then number three is the afterload. It's the determined by the pressure in the systemic circuit. Right, so that's right there. How much pressure is right there. Okay. So which of these three, just hold up 1, 2, or 3 right now in class or on Zoom, is the one that we actually would want to go down if we wanted to increase stroke volume? 1, 2, or 3. Okay. On Zoom, fingers. Zoom fingers. Okay. Good. Yeah. Yeah, we would want it to go down. Absolutely. So afterload is the one that actually has an inverse relationship with stroke volume. We'll put it that way. I don't want to confuse you by thinking that it does go down during exercise, because it doesn't, it goes up, okay? But it does, it's the only one of the three that has a inverse relationship with stroke volume. Both of these go up to help us increase stroke volume. Okay, questions on that one? Okay, so then let's put all that together in this kind of concept map that I put together that brings us down to cardiac output, okay? So cardiac output is dictated by heart rate and stroke volume, right? So heart rate has the two factors that control it, right? Or sorry, there's a stroke volume one, okay? And then heart rate has the two factors that control it, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, heart rate dictated by those two. Cardiac output is dictated by heart rate and stroke volume. Okay, then up over stroke volume, we've got the factors that determine it. So end diastolic volume and systolic volume. Those are how we measure stroke volume, right? End diastolic minus end systolic. Okay, end diastolic is going to be directly related to venous return, which is really, and then ejection fraction is going to be related to ESV. Of course, it's going to be related to EDV too. Okay, preload is kind of the concept part of the venous return and the end diastolic volume. Afterload is kind of up here on its own because that one's not really helping us increase stroke volume. And then contractility is really the concept over arching ejection fraction, right? How hard is the heart contracting? So we kind of already did this, but you can do this again as well. Which way do each of these move to help us increase cardiac output, right? So heart rate's going to go up. That's going to do that by parasympathetic going down, sympathetic going up. Okay, stroke volume is going to go up by EDV going up, venous return going up, preload going up. ESV goes down, right? Ejection fraction goes up because the heart's contracting harder. Contractility goes up. Afterload's also going to go up, but again, that doesn't help us increase cardiac output. It's just something that's happening. Okay, questions on that? Oops. All right, everybody got this? Good. Okay. All right, so let's look at these last couple slides here. So I talked about heart failure a little bit today. Really the definition is just there's some issue with the heart's ability to pump, okay? Could be the left side, could be the right side. Multiple causes, valve problems, right? If the valves aren't working well, then the blood goes backwards, and so the heart's not as effective, so it has to work harder to get the same amount of blood out, right? atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries. This can lead to low blood flow of the heart, which can lead to a heart attack. If some of that tissue dies, which would be here, an MI, that's myocardial infarction, or a heart attack is what it is. That actually, some of the heart tissue dies, then the rest of the heart has to make up for that dead tissue, and that makes it get overworked. And then chronic hypertension, we already talked about that one, gives you that high afterload, okay? And I already mentioned that the severity of heart failure is measured by ejection fraction, and also this other variable called VO2 max, which is how much oxygen your body's bringing in during maximal exercise. Okay, and then lastly, just one thing to understand about heart failure is it always leads to blood pooling somewhere, okay? So if you have left-sided heart failure, then the right ventricle is actually normal, but the left is weak. And so what you want to think about is the blood pools actually one step backwards from the weak part, okay? So where would that be here? That would be in the lungs, right? Because the blood's coming from the lungs to the left side of the heart, okay? So if you got a bunch of blood kind of filling the left side of the heart because it's not strong enough to get it out, then eventually it starts making its way back towards the lungs and you end up with pulmonary edema, right? Okay, so you get pulmonary congestion, pulmonary edema, which is just fluid buildup in the lungs, okay? If it's right-sided heart failure, then the left ventricle can be normal, but the right's weak. Blood's gonna pool one step back from the right side of the heart, which is where, that's the vena cava, right? That's just gonna go back into the body, okay? And so that's congestion and edema in the extremities, in the abdomen. So people that get really swollen ankles, and sometimes you see swelling in their abdomen, that can be related to right-sided heart failure. Typically, one side is what starts it, but then eventually the other side goes as well. So you kind of usually will end up having both sides of heart failure, but it usually starts with one or the other. Okay, so that's just a good way to think about that question, is what's one step back, and that's where the pooling is going to be. Okay, all right, guys, that's it. We're good. So have a good day in lab tomorrow, and study hard for that exam. And I'll be on my computer available during that exam time if anything comes up. But if not, good luck on that. We'll see you guys on Monday. All right.
Thank you.